There are moments in a hospital that go completely silent. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room full of people who have all, at precisely the same instant, stopped breathing. This was one of those moments. The boy couldn't have been older than 10, maybe 11 if you were generous. He was thin in the way that children are thin when they haven't had enough of anything for a long time. Not just food, but warmth, rest, the kind of steady care that puts weight on a person's bones and light behind their eyes. His gray t-shirt had a tear at the collar. His jeans were stiff with dried mud at the knees. His sneakers had no laces, just the tongue flopping loose. The way shoes look when a child has outgrown the luxury of caring about such things. He had walked into the hospital's staff break room on the 3rd floor carrying a toddler, a small boy, maybe 18 months old, limp and pale and burning with a fever that had turned his cheeks the color of old roses. And without a word to anyone in the room, he had turned on the cold tap at the sink, tested the water briefly with his elbow, the way someone had clearly taught him once, and begun, gently and methodically, to cool the baby down. That was when Dr. Raymond Kowalski had started shouting. Raymond Kowalski was 63 years old, chief of pediatrics, a man who had spent 4 decades building a reputation for precision and competence that left very little room for homeless children wandering into hospital break rooms and running tap water over other people's babies. He was pointing, his voice sharp and certain, the way the voices of men who are used to being obeyed tend to get when someone has failed to obey them. Get away from that sink. Get away from that child right now. Someone call security. Someone call, where did this child even come from? Get him away from... His fever is 104. The boy said it without looking up. Said it the way a person states a fact they are completely certain of, in a voice that was quiet but had something in it, something steady, something that had been tested, that cut straight through. Raymond shouting the way a clean knife cuts through noise. The room went still. The baby in the sink made a soft sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, as the cool water ran over his neck and the back of his head. His little fingers opened and closed. His color just slightly began to change. Raymond Kowalski, who had been a doctor for 40 years, looked at the homeless boy's hands, at the careful, practiced way he was supporting the infant's head at the angle of the water, at the deliberate and unhurried competence of every single movement, and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. He stopped shouting. The toddler's name was Benjamin Hardcastle. He was the youngest son of Gerald Hardcastle, which was a name that meant something in that city, had meant something for 2 generations. In fact, the way old money names do. Construction, originally, then real estate, then the kind of diversified holdings that stopped needing to be called anything in particular, because the name itself was enough. Gerald Hardcastle was 54 years old, worth more money than most people could usefully imagine, and he was currently sitting in a private waiting room on the 4th floor of this hospital in a state of absolute, controlled terror. The way men of his particular formation tend to experience fear, outwardly composed, inwardly coming apart at the seams. Benjamin had gone into a seizure 40 minutes ago. A febrile seizure, the medical team had explained, brought on by a fever that had spiked faster than anyone had anticipated. They had it under control, mostly. The seizure had passed, but the fever was still climbing, and the infant was unresponsive in the way that made even experienced nurses go quiet when they thought. The father wasn't looking. Gerald had been told to wait. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. He had made his entire life into a structure specifically designed to ensure that he never had to wait for anything important. And now the most important thing in his world, the small, warm, laughing creature who had taken his father's large, serious face and turned it soft again after decades of hardness, was somewhere down the hall being tended by people he was paying but could not control, and Gerald Hardcastle was sitting in a chair and waiting. And there was nothing at all, that his money could do about it. What he didn't know yet, what nobody had thought to tell him in the organized chaos of the past several minutes, and was that his son was currently in a staff break room on the floor below, in the careful hands of a homeless boy named Marcus Cole. Marcus was 10 years old. He had been living for the past 7 months in the covered walkway behind the hospital's east wing, where a heating vent kept the worst. of the winter away and where the night. Staff had quietly, over time, begun leaving sandwiches and juice boxes in a paper bag near the door. Nobody talked about it officially. It was one of those small human arrangements that exist in the gaps between policy and decency. His mother had gone into this same hospital 8 months ago and not come back out. Not in the way that meant she'd recovered and gone somewhere else. Just not come back out. Marcus knew what that meant. He was 10, not 6. He understood the things adults tried to tell him gently. He'd had no other family to go to. Social services had been called eventually, but the machinery of that system moves at its own pace, and Marcus had slipped through a gap in it, the way small and quiet children sometimes do, and found himself outside the building where his mother had last been alive, and decided in the way that children decide enormous things, simply, without drama, that this was where he would stay for a while. He had learned a great deal in 7 months from watching, from listening to nurses talk on their smoke breaks, from asking careful questions of the orderlies who brought the paper bags of food, the ones who didn't pretend he wasn't there. He'd learned about fevers and what they could do to very small children. He'd learned about cooling, about hydration, about the particular danger of a temperature that climbs too fast. He'd learned the way a child learns when learning feels like survival, which means he'd learned it completely and kept every bit of it. He'd found the toddler in the hallway outside the elevator. How Benjamin had gotten there, who had let go of his hand for 30 seconds too long in the confusion of that afternoon, was a question that would be answered later with considerable embarrassment by a junior nurse. Marcus had felt the baby's forehead with the back of his hand, the way he'd seen the nurses do, and the heat had been immediate and alarming, and Marcus had not stopped to wonder whether he was allowed to do anything about it. He had simply done it. Dr. Kowalski moved slowly toward the sink and stood beside the boy, watching. He watched the angle of the water. He watched the way Marcus used his own forearm to block the stream from hitting the baby's face directly. He watched the boy's eyes, which never left the infant, which were focused with a quality of attention that Raymond, in 40 years, had learned to recognize as the real thing. "What's his temperature now?" Raymond asked quietly. "Feels like it's coming down," Marcus said. "His hands are less stiff." "That's good. When they're real sick, they get stiff in the hands." Raymond looked at the nurse beside him, who nodded, barely perceptibly. "Where did you learn that?" Raymond asked. "Listening," Marcus said simply. One of the nurses had already gone for a proper cooling blanket. Another had paged the pediatric team. The room was moving again. Professionally, purposefully, the way hospital rooms move when everyone knows what to do. But Raymond stayed at the sink, next to the boy, and watched. Because there was something happening here that he didn't want to manage away before he'd properly seen it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus." "How old are you, Marcus?" 10. Raymond was quiet for a moment. "You probably saved this baby's life," he said. "You know that?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He kept his attention on the infant, who was whimpering softly now, which was a far better sound than silence. Then, without looking up, he said, "Somebody should have been watching him better." It wasn't accusatory the way he said it, just factual, the same tone he'd used when he announced the fever, just the plain truth, spoken by someone who had learned, young, that plain truths were usually worth saying. Raymond Kowalski, who had not cried in a hospital since his 3rd year of residency, felt something move behind his eyes that he had to look away to manage. Gerald Hardcastle was brought downstairs 10 minutes later, once Benjamin was stable and properly attended and wrapped in a cooling blanket and beginning slowly to return to himself. He stood in the doorway of the break room and looked at his son, and then at the medical team, and then at the thin boy in the torn gray shirt standing off to one side, holding his own elbows, watching the baby with the particular expression of someone making sure the thing they fixed stays fixed. "Who is that?" Gerald asked very quietly. Raymond told him briefly what had happened. Gerald listened without moving. His face did the thing that faces do when they're absorbing something too large to process quickly, and went very still, and then very carefully arranged itself so that the people around him couldn't see what was happening behind it. Then he crossed the room and knelt down in front of Marcus Cole, which was a thing Gerald Hardcastle had not done in front of other people. in a very long time, and perhaps had never done quite like this. Not from obligation, not from strategy, but simply because the moment required it. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words, the way 2 words can sometimes hold everything. Marcus looked at him steadily. "He's going to be okay," he said. "His color's good now." Gerald nodded. He looked at the boy's shoes, the laces gone, the tongue loose, and at the tear in his collar, and at the careful, serious face of a child who had been carrying too much for too long and was carrying it. Anyway, the way good people do. "Where are you staying?" Gerald asked. Marcus glanced toward the window which faced the east wing. Gerald followed his gaze, understood, sat with that understanding for a moment. "Not anymore," he said gently. "Not after today." What followed happened quietly, over weeks and months, the way real change tends to happen. Not in grand announcements, but in steady, practical steps. A foster arrangement, proper and legal, with a family Gerald knew personally and trusted completely, in a house with a yard and a school 2 blocks away that Marcus would later describe, with characteristic understatement, as pretty good. Gerald paid for everything and then kept paying, not out of guilt, but out of something simpler and harder to name. The recognition that the world had, on one particular afternoon, been held together by a 10-year-old boy with no laces in his shoes, and that this was a debt not of money but of attention. He visited Marcus regularly. At first, with Benjamin in tow, the toddler took to Marcus immediately, in the uncomplicated way that small children attach to the people who have held them in their most frightened moments. Later, as Marcus grew, the visits became less formal. Dinners, school events, a conversation about college when the time came, that Marcus navigated with the same quiet seriousness he'd brought to everything else. Raymond Kowalski retired 2 years later and left a donation to the hospital in Marcus's name, specifically for a fund that trained young volunteers, teenagers from difficult circumstances, in basic pediatric first response. He told the story at the retirement dinner, and the room went still in the same way the break room had gone still all those years before. Marcus Cole became a pediatric nurse at 24. He worked the same floor in the same hospital where his mother had died and where he had once lived in a heating vent's warmth and learned, one overheard conversation at a time, how to keep small things alive. He was very good at it. He never forgot, in all the years of his career, what it felt like to be the child in the room that nobody thought was supposed to be there. And so he made sure, in every interaction, in every quiet moment at a bedside or a sink or a hallway, that the people in his care knew, felt, not just heard, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. That somebody saw them, that somebody was paying attention. It didn't cost anything, that kind of attention. Marcus had known that since he was 10 years old, standing at a sink in a torn gray shirt, doing the only thing that made sense, taking care of the small ones, making sure they stayed warm.